blackness of space, cold and indifferent, stretches infinitely in every direction. In the void between stars, where the Emperor's light barely reaches, the whispered voices of the damned call out. The chaos. Space Marines, once noble defenders of the Imperium, now serve a dark and twisted purpose, to bring the Emperor's fragile dominion to its knees. Their minds are shattered, their hearts consumed by hate. But in that hate lies an unparalleled power, a force so deep that even the most valiant of soldiers tremble in fear. To understand the mind of a Chaos Space Marine is to venture into a storm of chaos and suffering, where reason holds no sway, and the only truth is the one twisted by the dark gods themselves. But who, in the end, is the monster, and who is the victim? What if the Emperor's light wasn't enough to keep them from falling? If you find yourself captivated by the tale of these broken souls, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Join us as we delve deeper into the shadows of the Warhammer 40K universe, uncovering secrets that have been lost to time. The sun was fading from the sky as the battle raged on, a crimson glow staining the air with the scent of blood and fire. The battlefield stretched endlessly, littered with the twisted remains of broken soldiers, their once strong bodies now shattered and ruined. But among the bodies, there was one who stood taller than the rest, his once pristine armor, marked with the scars of countless battles, now streaked with the ichor of enemies long forgotten. This warrior was different, though. His eyes, once filled with purpose and loyalty, were now dull, hollow, as if he had become a mere shell of his former self. The Emperor's light had long since faded from his heart. The first cracks in his resolve had come slowly, so imperceptibly that he had barely noticed them. He remembered the first time he had killed without hesitation, the first time his blade had found its mark not in the name of duty, but in the desperate hunger for something more. A feeling, a thirst that no prayer could quench, no vow could silence. His comrades had spoken of it too, these whispers that had started in the dead of night, in the moments between battles, when only the stars bore witness to their thoughts. They had been subtle at first, like a faint breeze brushing against the skin, tantalizing, yet so easily dismissed. But as the years had passed, the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. The Emperor's will had become a distant echo in the back of his mind, drowned out by the promises of something far greater. It had not been a single moment of betrayal, but 1,000 small ones, each one chipping away at the foundation of who he had once been. The Emperor, the God Emperor of mankind, was no longer the beacon of light he had once been. His words, once sacred, now seemed hollow. The ideals of duty, sacrifice, and honor that had once guided him through the darkest of days began to feel like chains. Heavy, suffocating chains that held him in place while the rest of the galaxy moved on. He had heard the rumors. Of course, the whispers of the dark gods, the ones who promised power, immortality, and release from the endless wars of the Imperium. They were nothing but lies, he had thought at first, but the longer he fought, the more it seemed that the Emperor had abandoned them all. And if the Emperor would not come to their aid, perhaps it was time to seek another way. The first battle had been a turning point. They had fought against the orcs, the endless tide of green-skinned beasts that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, all at once. It had been a slaughter, the sound of weapons clashing against crude orc armor filling the air. But something had shifted in him then. The thrill of the kill, the power of the blade, the primal satisfaction of watching his enemies fall before him. For the first time, he had felt truly alive. And that was the moment. That was when the darkness first began to seep into his soul. It wasn't long before the others began to notice. His brothers in arms, the warriors who had once fought beside him with a shared bond of loyalty, had started to look at him differently. Their eyes were filled with suspicion, with fear, and something more, something he could not name. But in their eyes, he saw the same thing he had seen in his own reflection, the beginning of something horrible, something dangerous. The whispers grew louder in his mind. He had fought to protect humanity, to defend the Emperor's will. But now there was a new will, a darker will, that whispered promises of power beyond imagination. He had seen the ruins of worlds, the shattered remnants of empires long forgotten, and the blood-soaked temples where the dark god's followers had worshipped with fervor. There was something in those ruins, something that called to him. A power, a promise that felt almost too tempting to resist. It was as if the galaxy had become a canvas, and he was the instrument of its destruction. His mind wavered, teetering on the edge of something he could not yet comprehend, something that went beyond the walls of his faith. In the quiet of the night, after the fires of battle had burned themselves out, he could hear it, the voices, soft at first, whispers in the dark, then louder, calling his name, offering him a path forward, a path beyond the reach of the Imperium. And he had listened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he had begun to turn his back on everything he had once known. He had taken the first steps down the path of madness. But it was not the darkness that scared him. It was the hunger, the deep, insatiable need for something more, something that could never be quenched. As the last of his human ties unraveled, he embraced the power offered by the dark gods, his soul a twisted reflection of the soldier he had once been. And with that power, he had become something far more than human, something far worse. The Emperor's light was no more. Now, he served only the darkness. The change was subtle at first, like the shifting of shadows in a dark room, but soon it became undeniable. The voices that had once been faint whispers, mere fragments of thought in the depths of his mind, now echoed with a deafening clarity. Each day, they spoke louder, more insistent, until they became the very rhythm of his thoughts. They were no longer distant, intangible things. They were real, alive, feeding off his doubt, his despair, his rage. Khorne's wrath, Tzeentch's trickery, Nurgle's decay, and Slaanesh's indulgence. All of them called to him, their promises of power, immortality, and indulgence ringing through his skull like a sweet, maddening symphony. The soldier he had once been, the one who had fought for honor and the Emperor, was slipping away. He could feel it, as if each passing moment he was losing another piece of his humanity, each shred of his old identity burning away in the forge of the dark gods. His armor, once a symbol of his service to the Imperium, was now little more than a shell. It clung to him like a second skin, an uncomfortable reminder of who he had been. Now, the symbols of the Imperium, once sacred, seemed like mockery. The aquila on his chest, the symbol of the Emperor, was nothing but a tarnished relic of a past he could no longer remember with pride. His transformation was not only mental, but physical. The chaos gods, ever watchful, had begun to twist him, reshaping his body as they had reshaped his mind. His once strong form began to show signs of decay and corruption. His hands, once firm and steady, now trembled with the feverish energy of chaos. The veins beneath his skin began to pulse with dark, unnatural energy. The veins blackened like cracks in ancient stone. His muscles, once toned and disciplined, began to swell in grotesque proportions, the raw power surging through them a perverse parody of his former self. His body was changing, mutating, becoming something new. And in that change, he felt an eerie sense of liberation. This, he thought, was the true nature of power. This was freedom. But it was a freedom forged in suffering. The first signs of madness came in flashes, images, hallucinations that were both terrifying and exhilarating. He would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering in his chest. Faces would appear to him in the dark, twisted and warped by the visions of the chaos gods. His brothers in arms, too, were changing. They had once been like him, warriors of the Emperor, but now they were becoming something different. Their eyes, once filled with camaraderie, were now cold and distant, haunted by the same voices that tormented him. They no longer spoke of their duties with pride, but with an insatiable hunger for war, for blood. They had already embraced the madness fully, their minds lost to the chaos they served. But it wasn't just the voices or the madness that consumed him. It was the cravings, the deep, gnawing desires that tore at him from within. He could feel the darkness building, his need for battle, for destruction, surging with each passing day. There was no longer a place for honor in his mind, no place for restraint. The power of chaos beckoned, urging him to break free of the chains that had once bound him to the Imperium. His every thought was consumed by the lust for bloodshed, the craving for carnage that could never be sated. Every victory, every slaughter, was but a fleeting moment of satisfaction, followed by an even greater hunger. It was a cycle that spiraled downward into an abyss with no escape. He could feel the transformation deep within him, an overwhelming sense of inevitability. There was no going back. The Emperor's light was gone, replaced by the promise of something greater, something darker. He had heard the stories, the rumors of those who had embraced the chaos gods fully, those who had transcended their mortal forms and become something more. These were no mere men. They were gods in their own right, wielding power beyond imagination. And in that moment, he longed for that power, a power that could bend the universe to his will, that could break the chains that had once held him in place. But even as the darkness claimed him, he could still remember the fleeting glimmer of his former self, the soldier who had fought for the Emperor, who had believed in the nobility of his cause. That memory, once a beacon of light in the depths of his mind, was now little more than a dying ember, flickering in the storm of his madness. It haunted him, driving him deeper into the arms of chaos, for there was no other choice. There was only the promise of more power, more destruction, more indulgence. He could feel the dark god's eyes upon him, their influence suffusing his every thought, every action. And as he stood on the precipice of damnation, he knew one thing. The soldier he had been was dead. What stood before the galaxy now was something far worse. A creature born of madness, a servant of chaos. The battlefield never ceased. Day after day, week after week, the endless march of war continued. It was a cycle with no end, a storm that churned across the galaxy, sweeping everything in its wake. The once precise drills of the Imperial soldiers had become nothing more than distant memories. The thrill of combat had long since dulled into an endless, grinding routine, each battle blending into the next, a haze of violence and death. For the Chaos Space Marine, this was no longer just survival. It was a test. A trial laid out by the dark gods themselves to see who could withstand the endless tide of destruction and emerge more powerful for it. With each battle, his mind became further entrenched in the darkness. It was no longer about victory. It was no longer about defending a noble cause or even achieving something tangible. There were no more strategic objectives, no more supply lines, no more victories to be counted on a battlefield. There was only war. The struggle was the point. The act of fighting had become its own reward, the bloodshed a sacred ritual, an offering to the chaos gods who had seen fit to bless him with their power. His comrades were no longer the soldiers he had once fought alongside. They, too, were shaped by the eternal war, their minds and bodies twisted in the same crucible that had forged him. The bond between them had shifted from one of brotherhood to one of shared damnation. They were no longer warriors of the Imperium, fighting for the Emperor's glory. They were agents of destruction, bringing suffering and death in the name of the dark gods who had claimed them. There was no more honor in their ranks, no more sense of purpose. There was only the hunger, the insatiable desire to fight, to kill, to destroy. It was a hunger that could never be sated. The more they killed, the more they wanted. The more they fought, the more they needed. The Marine could feel it. This endless battle was a trap, one set by the Chaos Gods to ensure that he would never escape, that he would never be free. The chains of war had bound him, and there was no way to break free. Every victory only brought more enemies. Every victory only deepened the abyss into which he had fallen. And yet, despite this, there was a perverse satisfaction in it. With each swing of his blade, with each strike of his bolter, he could feel the power surging within him, an intoxicating force that made him feel stronger, more invincible. But even as he reveled in the chaos of battle, there was something that gnawed at him, something that whispered in the back of his mind. Was this all there was? Was this the entirety of his existence now? To fight, to destroy, to serve a twisted purpose that offered no reprieve? The endless battles, the endless war. It was a cage that he could never escape. The voices of the dark gods promised him everything he had ever wanted: power, immortality, the freedom to bend the universe to his will. But in return, they demanded his soul. And in that, he realized the truth. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for something else entirely. The idea of freedom, of redemption, seemed distant, almost laughable now. It had been so long since he had seen the light of the Emperor, since he had felt the weight of duty upon his shoulders. All that was left now was the constant drive to destroy, to feed the hunger that had consumed him. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the Chaos Gods. It belonged to the war. Each battle, each skirmish, took him deeper into the abyss. The chains of war tightened, and with each turn of the tide, he felt less and less like the man he had once been. His mind, warped by the touch of chaos, could no longer distinguish between friend and foe. The lines had blurred. Allies became enemies. Enemies became allies. And it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the bloodshed. Nothing mattered except the war. And so he fought, endlessly. He fought because there was no escape. He fought because it was all he knew. The man he had once been, the loyal servant of the Emperor, was nothing more than a distant memory, buried beneath the rubble of time and madness. What remained was a soldier of chaos, a being born of destruction, whose sole purpose was to wage war upon the galaxy. In the quiet moments, when the battle had passed and the echoes of war faded into the distance, he could hear it again. The voices, louder now, more insistent. They called him to greater battles, to deeper horrors. The temptation to embrace the dark gods fully was overwhelming. They offered him more power, more strength than he had ever known. But at what cost? Was there any part of him left that could resist? Or was he already lost to the chaos that had claimed his soul? The war continued, and the Marines stood at the precipice, looking into the abyss that had become his existence. He was a slave to the battle, a servant of destruction, bound by chains forged in the fires of madness. And with each passing day, those chains grew tighter until he could no longer remember a time when he was free. The whispers had become a chorus, deafening in its intensity. It was not just the voices anymore. It was their presence, unseen but all-encompassing. They were there, always. The dark gods, each one vying for his soul, each one pushing him further into their grasp. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. They had become the four corners of his reality. They were no longer distant gods who resided in the far corners of the galaxy, their names whispered in fear and awe. Now, they were his constant companions, their desires twisting his every thought, their wills guiding his every action. Khorne's rage, raw and fiery, thrummed through his veins like a burning brand. It was a hunger, a thirst for bloodshed that could never be sated. He could feel it every time he swung his blade, every time the scream of a dying foe rang in his ears. The more he killed, the stronger the need grew. The power of Khorne coursed through him, making him feel like a god of war, invincible, unstoppable, the very embodiment of destruction. But even that power came at a cost. Each life he took, each battle he fought, was a step closer to losing what little humanity remained within him. But the rage was all-consuming. It clouded his judgment, pushing him into battle after battle, each one more brutal than the last. And then there was Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the master of fate and knowledge. Tzeentch's influence was insidious. It whispered to him in riddles, showed him visions of possible futures, of paths he could take, each one more twisted and complicated than the last. There were no certainties anymore. There was no right or wrong, only the flow of change. Tzeentch promised him power, control, the ability to shape the future as he saw fit. And yet, in the silence of his thoughts, he could hear the whispers of uncertainty. Every choice he made felt like it had been predestined by the fickle hands of the god of change. His every move was part of a larger scheme, a plan that was beyond his comprehension. And it unsettled him. It unsettled him deeply. Nurgle, too, had a hold on him. The plague god, the lord of decay, had whispered to him in the dark, showing him the inevitability of death, the beauty of decay. His body, already corrupted by the touch of chaos, began to change further under Nurgle's influence. His once strong frame was now filled with sickness, with rot that spread like a slow poison through his veins. But it was not a painful decay. It was an acceptance, a surrender to the inevitable. Nurgle's gifts were strange, a twisted form of vitality. The corruption that spread through his body was not a curse, but a blessing, a way to transcend the frailties of mortality. He felt stronger, more resilient, as if the decay was making him impervious to death itself. But it was a hollow strength. Every moment was filled with the sensation of his own corruption, the slow rot that had claimed his body, his soul. It was as though he was becoming one with the very essence of death itself. And though the power was undeniable, it was impossible to ignore the creeping sense that he was becoming something less than human. And Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, the Lord of Pleasure, had drawn him into a different kind of temptation. Slaanesh's whispers were the most seductive of all. The allure of excess, of indulgence, of pleasures beyond imagination beckoned him like a siren's call. It was not just about the power, it was about sensation. Every indulgence, every act of excess was a taste of the forbidden, a glimpse into a world where he could shed the weight of the galaxy and immerse himself in endless pleasure. But there was a price. The more he gave into the indulgence, the more it consumed him. His desires began to twist, becoming something darker, more perverse. Each act of indulgence was followed by an emptiness, a hunger that could never be filled. The need for more, for something deeper, greater, more extreme. It was all-consuming. And in the moments of pleasure, when he could almost forget the war, the madness, the corruption, it was fleeting. It was never enough. The voices of the gods swirled in his mind, each one vying for his attention, pulling him in different directions. They were not just gods. They were his reality. They shaped his thoughts, his desires, his very existence. The more he embraced them, the more he felt himself slipping away. There was no longer a him. There was only their will, their influence, their whispers that drowned out everything else. The world of the Imperium, the Emperor, the very ideals he had once fought for, were all fading, slipping into the darkness, replaced by the hunger, the rage, the pleasure, the decay. He had become an instrument of chaos, a vessel for their power, their will. But as much as he had embraced them, there was a gnawing feeling deep inside him, a feeling of loss. He was losing himself. The warrior he had once been was gone, consumed by the very power he had sought to control. Was it worth it? Was the power he had gained worth the price of his soul? These questions haunted him, but they were fleeting. The gods had answered them long ago. There was no way back now. There was only the path forward, the path that led ever deeper into the embrace of chaos. And so he followed, driven by the will of the gods who had claimed him, his mind twisted, his body corrupted, his soul lost to the dark. The end was inevitable. It loomed before him like the black, endless horizon, an unstoppable force dragging him deeper into the abyss. In the beginning, there had been flickers of doubt, moments of hesitation. There had been whispers of something else. Redemption, perhaps. Or at least the faint hope of reclaiming the man he had once been. But that was long gone now, consumed by the very forces he had sought to wield. The gods had broken him, reshaped him into something that no longer resembled the warrior he had once been. His thoughts, once clear and noble, had been distorted beyond recognition. His body, twisted by the touch of chaos, was now little more than a mockery of the man he had been. There was no going back. There was nothing left but the dark. In the depths of the warp, where time and space had no meaning, the Marine had found himself at the precipice of a terrible truth. There was no redemption for him, no salvation, only the endless cycle of war, of chaos, of bloodshed. His soul had been sold long ago, traded for the hollow promise of power and immortality. But immortality came at a price. It was not the blessing he had imagined. It was a curse, a never-ending existence filled with suffering, madness, and the gnawing hunger that could never be sated. And as he looked out across the desolate wastelands of a dying world, he realized the true cost of his transformation. What had he become? A monster, a creature of madness and rage. There was no trace of the soldier he had been, no remnant of the honor, the duty that had once defined him. Those ideals, those beliefs, were gone. They had died long ago, crushed beneath the weight of the Chaos God's demands. He had been an instrument of destruction, a pawn in a war that had no end. And now he was nothing more than a puppet, his strings pulled by the gods who had claimed him, his every thought and action dictated by their will. The galaxy had changed too. It no longer seemed like a place of hope and purpose. The Imperium, once a bastion of light, now appeared as a distant memory, a fading echo in the darkness. The Emperor, once the guiding force behind the defense of mankind, had become little more than a myth. And yet, the Chaos Gods thrived. They fed on the suffering of the universe, growing stronger with every conflict, with every soul lost to their power. The Imperium had fallen, and with it, any hope of redemption. But even in this moment of finality, there was no peace. There was only the endless war, the eternal struggle for dominance. He had become a tool, a weapon in the hands of the gods, fighting a war that would never end. He could feel the weight of his soul slipping away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the endless hunger, the endless desire to fight, to kill, to destroy. It was all he knew now, all he could do. The man he had once been was gone. He had been erased, consumed by the very darkness he had once fought against. As he stood in the ruins of a fallen world, staring out into the void of space, he realized that there was no escape. The voices of the Chaos Gods, once so distant, now filled his mind completely, their whispers drowning out everything else. He had become a part of them, an extension of their will, a servant of their eternal hunger. There was no more fighting, there was no more resistance, there was only the will of chaos, and the endless tide of destruction that followed in its wake. He could still remember, faintly, the feeling of loyalty, the feeling of standing beside his brothers in arms, fighting for a cause greater than himself. But that man was gone. The brotherhood had been shattered, the bonds broken by the corruption of chaos. He was alone now, surrounded by enemies both internal and external. The chains of war had bound him tight, and there was no escape. The gods were pleased. They had claimed another soul. Another warrior had fallen to their will. And in the cold, eternal night of the galaxy, his soul would burn forever, consumed by the flames of chaos. There would be no light, no redemption, only the endless darkness that awaited him. And as he felt the final remnants of his humanity slip away, he embraced the truth that had been with him all along. He was beyond redemption. There was no turning back.